Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about people who made grave mistakes. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The New Member, and it's about a group of church members who witness something horrifying as their pastor begins a ceremony. The second story you'll hear is called Robin Hood, and it's about a teenager who looks at his phone and thinks his life is over. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Sailor's Diagnosis, and it's about a doctor who begins to lose his mind after declaring one of his patients dead. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to buy the follow button in order of their favorite food, fried chicken. But before you hand it over, be sure to remove the crispy outer layer from each piece. Okay, let's get into our first story called The New Member. At 10:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2005, a 33-year-old pastor named Kyle Lake stood on a stage inside of the University Baptist Church in Waco, Texas. Kyle had just finished delivering that morning's sermon to his congregation, which included about 800 people. And now he was about to welcome a new member, a young woman. So Kyle had been the pastor of this church for the last 7 years. And over that time, the church had really grown and evolved, really directly because of Kyle's leadership. He was known as being a very thoughtful and educated pastor, who was also known to be quite fun and progressive. He often would play pranks on the congregation and keep things really light, even if he was in the middle of a very important sermon. And people liked that. It made him relatable. And so because of Kyle's youthful energy that he clearly gave off, he had sort of gradually shifted the congregation to being a much more young crowd. Predominantly the folks who attended the church were college kids, or roughly that age. And also his wife was an attendee at the church, as were his 3 little kids, who at the moment, as he was up on stage, they were across the hall attending kids' Bible study. Now for Kyle, welcoming a new member into this church had become a very big deal for him. He in fact had this special ceremony he would perform for each and every new member. And really the whole congregation got behind this ceremony. And so today, Kyle was about to do this ceremony with this new member, this young woman. And so Kyle, in front of the whole congregation, he calls this woman up, come on up, we're gonna do the ceremony to welcome you to the church. And so the woman, she gets up and she walks up to the front of the stage, she smiles, and Kyle says hello to her and sort of introduces himself, and the whole church is listening. And then Kyle, as part of this ritual, moved to the very center of the stage, where the actual ceremony was going to take place. And he was about to call the woman up to join him in the center of the stage when there was a malfunction. Now, the malfunction itself was not really a huge deal. All it did was just stop Kyle for a second, and he had to stop talking to the new member, and he had to figure out what he was going to do, but quickly he saw a fix that didn't even require him to leave the stage. However, the instant he actually made the fix, when he fixed the malfunction, as he was about to start talking to the whole audience again, he just began to scream. Now, at first, nobody took this seriously because their pastor was known for playing pranks on the congregation. And so everybody just thought it was a prank, albeit a strange one. I mean, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, but everyone's sort of looking around like, this is a prank, right? But then Kyle's screams began to include words. He began screaming, "Help! Help me!" And at that point, it sort of clicked for the whole congregation that this was not a joke. Something was terribly wrong. Even though they're looking up at him and nothing appeared to be wrong. Nothing made sense. And so immediately it was like the church spiraled into chaos and confusion. People are bowing their heads, praying as fiercely as they could, praying for his safety. Others are sprinting out of the church, not even knowing what to do. And still more were calling 911, like several people calling 911. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, it was like people still had no idea what actually was happening. In fact, honestly, the paramedics didn't. It was like, what is this? But within a few days, they were able to figure out what happened, and it surprised everyone. So the special ceremony that Kyle would perform for every new member was a baptism. And so when Kyle moved to the very center of the stage, and he actually called up the woman to join him in the center of the stage, he actually was stepping into the baptismal pool. Picture like a hot tub, waist-high water, it's warm water. And so Kyle literally stepped into the hot tub and he's calling up this woman to join him in the pool so she can be baptized. However, before this woman actually got to the pool, Kyle has this malfunction. And all it was is his lapel mic shut off. It wasn't working anymore. And because the church he was in was huge and cavernous, sound really didn't travel well. He needed a microphone to project his voice, and so he had to stop the ceremony for a second and find another microphone. Luckily, there was a stand with a microphone in it right within arm's reach, and so Kyle grabbed it. However, what Kyle didn't know was there actually was a second malfunction that had happened either at this instant or just before, but either way, there was another malfunction that he had no idea about. And that was that the heaters of the baptismal pool that kept the water warm were damaged. And as a result of this damage, the water in that pool had become electrically charged. And so the instant Kyle grabbed that microphone, he grounded the electricity in the pool. Basically, he created a pathway for the electricity to travel through his body. When he began to scream, that was him being electrocuted. Despite the efforts of first responders and the medical staff at the hospital, Kyle unfortunately did not survive. As for Kyle's wife, who literally watched this happen from the front row of the church, she watched her husband be killed. She ultimately sued the electrical company that installed those heaters in the baptismal pool, and she would settle for an undisclosed amount of money. Our next story is called Robin Hood. In the spring of 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was really kicking into high gear, students at the University of Nebraska were told to move out of their dorms and move back home with their families to prevent the spread of the virus. One student, 20-year-old Alex Kearns, who was enrolled at Nebraska on an ROTC scholarship, was just as shocked as everybody else at how quickly this pandemic had turned their life upside down. But in terms of going back home again, he wasn't that upset about it because he was close with his family and he figured some unexpected time with them would be nice. Once he got back to his hometown of Naperville, Illinois, which is an affluent suburb outside of Chicago, he quickly fell into a quarantine routine, which consisted mostly of screen time and lounging around. But in the evenings, he would put his screens away and he would go into the kitchen with his mother Dorothy, and the two of them would chat for hours about all sorts of things. One night, he told his mom that he was feeling kind of nervous about what he was going to do with his life after college, that even though he was studying business out at the University of Nebraska, he didn't really know what he was going to do with that. All he knew was that he wanted to find a way to help people. And his mother and everybody that knew Alex would say that that's just Alex. He was this really gentle, nice, awesome person that everybody just adored. After being home for a few weeks, Alex was starting to get bored of his quarantine routine, and he began looking for other things to do. He had seen a number of ads for a new brokerage app called Robinhood that was becoming increasingly popular amongst people his age. Unlike other trading platforms, Robinhood was designed for the common person. There was not huge fees that needed to be paid by the investor as soon as they logged on, and the app was very sleek, and it turned trading kind of into a game on the app. Alex had a few $1,000s in his bank account, and so he figured, you know what the heck, I'll download Robinhood and see what I can do. What's the worst that can happen? After trading on Robinhood for a couple of days, Alex was hooked, and he showed his family that he was actually making a little bit of money, and he was learning about the stock market. His parents would later recall when they found out he was using Robinhood, they weren't concerned because Alex had always been incredibly careful with his money, saving most of it and very rarely spending much of it. And so they figured, he might lose his savings, but he's certainly not going to fall into significant debt. That's just not Alex. Also, there was a safety mechanism in basic accounts on Robinhood that protected first-time users from going above $10,000 in debt. So even if Alex tried to lose more than that, the app wouldn't allow him so long as he was using a basic account. As the weeks went on, Alex got more and more confident in his trading ability, and he got really familiar with the Robinhood app. And one day he noticed there was one function he had not tried on the app called options trading. For context, traditional trading goes like this. Somebody identifies a stock that they like, and then they gamble on it. And the way they gamble on it is they buy shares of that stock, and if the stock increases in value, they make more money. If the stock loses value, they lose money. Very simple. But some people either can't afford the shares or don't want to buy the shares, but they still want to get in on the action of the stock market. And for those people, they can use something called options trading. Instead of buying shares, options traders will basically sell an insurance policy to other traders who have already purchased shares. And this insurance policy they're offering is known as an option. These option traders will go up to these shareholders and they'll say, for example, I'll give you $500 in exchange if your stock tanks and you're losing a ton of money. You can exercise your option, i.e. cash in your insurance policy, and I, the option holder, will cover all of your losses. But if your stock stays steady or gains in value, I still get to keep your $500. That's non-refundable. Naturally, these options traders, they need to be savvy about which stocks they're prepared to cover with their option. Because if that stock tanks and the shareholder decides to sell, i.e. exercise their option, then the option holder is obligated to immediately buy all of the shares at a premium. And if that shareholder has, let's say, hundreds of thousands of shares, well, too bad, the option holder is buying all of them. So when Alex clicked on the options trading button inside of his Robinhood app, it brought him immediately to an application because Robinhood had to make sure anybody on their app that was going to be buying or selling options, they needed to be an experienced trader and they needed to understand the risks because they were much higher than a basic account. There was no limit to how much debt someone could fall into in trading options. Alex was a smart guy and a motivated trader, but he knew nothing about options trading. And so when he saw this application, I'm sure he thought to himself, yeah, I know nothing about options trading. There's no way I could possibly get into this. But he decided, what the heck? I will apply to go onto their options trading side just to see if they'll accept me. So he fills out the application and almost immediately he is accepted onto that side of the platform. It would later turn out that application was kind of a sham. It did not really do very much to restrict access to that side. Alex was surprised at his acceptance, but he was also very excited. And right away, he started trading options, and he was pretty good at it. And pretty quickly, he was making a little bit of money. But then on June 11th, he got a notification on his phone from Robinhood. And so he pulled his phone up, he opened the app, and he saw his account was restricted. He couldn't make any new trades, and he couldn't make any withdrawals. And so as he looked at it, he scrolled down to the bottom of the page, and he saw his current balance. And it read negative $730,000. A trader that Alex had sold an option to was exercising his option because his stock had tanked, and he owned over $700,000 worth of shares that now Alex was obligated to buy. Alex couldn't believe what he was looking at, and he immediately fired off an email to Robinhood customer support saying there had to have been a mistake, that he had done the math before he had sold that option, and he thought at most he was exposed to losing maybe $10,000, certainly not $700,000. And so after he sent this email, a couple of minutes later, he got a message back from Robinhood, but it was just an automated response that just said, hey, we got your email and we're busy and we'll be sure to be in touch with you as soon as we possibly can. And so at this point, Alex is starting to panic a little bit because he's looking at his phone and this looks real. He's trying to go through his phone to find some place that would show him this was a mistake, but there's nothing that indicates this is a mistake. And so after a couple of hours, Alex is just laying in his bed, he can't sleep, and he sends another message to the customer support team at Robinhood, pleading with them to please check his account. There has to have been a mistake. There's no way I would have exposed myself to $700,000 of debt. But again, all he gets is an automated response that says, we're busy and we'll be in touch with you soon. A couple hours later at 3:26 a.m., Alex is still awake, probably pacing around his room, totally panic-stricken, and he looks at his phone and there's another email from Robinhood, and he's thinking, oh my goodness, thank you, someone's gotten in touch with me to tell me this has been a horrible mistake. And so he opens his email, and the header of the email is immediate action required. And what it was a notice for him to make his first payment on this enormous debt. It was going to be about $170,000 that he had to pay in the next couple of days. And if he didn't make this first payment, they would seek legal action against him. Alex was probably terrified, and also he was ashamed and didn't want to tell his parents. And so all alone in his room, he writes a third email to Robinhood, now straight up begging them, someone please look at my account. This has got to be wrong. But again, he just got the automated message. And so for the rest of the night, Alex probably laid on his bed thinking the world was just crashing in on him. He knew there was no way he could pay this enormous bill, and if he didn't pay it, he would either go to jail or hand it off to his family, which would financially ruin them. And just the idea of doing that to the people he loved made him sick. He just could not face that as one of his options. And so by the time the sun came up the next morning, Alex had come to a conclusion about what he was going to do. He started by pulling out his phone and pulling up the Robinhood app and screenshotting the dashboard that showed his enormous negative balance. And then he went on his laptop and he wrote a long letter to his family and he put it on his desktop so they would understand why he did what he was about to do. And then he left the house, hopped on his bike, and pedaled away. A couple hours later, a police officer arrived at the Kearns' household, and he told them that their son, their brother, Alex, was unfortunately deceased. He had thrown himself in front of a train. The family was beyond devastated. This caught them so completely off guard, it didn't make any sense. Alex was a happy, funny guy with plans for the future. He had shown no indications that he wanted to harm himself. It really just didn't make any sense. And so at some point that day, they went to his laptop, they opened it up, and there was that note he wrote. And in this letter, he explains to his family how he had fallen into this enormous debt on Robinhood. He attaches the screenshot that showed his huge negative balance. And he said it was just crazy that this company would allow a 20-year-old with no income to be exposed to over $700,000 of debt. He thought that was crazy, but he admitted he didn't know that much about options trading and probably shouldn't have been accepted into their program to begin with. And then he tells his family that he did want to live, but unfortunately, this was the only way he could get out of this problem without inflicting enormous financial penalties on his family. And so he believed he was protecting his family when he took his life. 24 hours later, Robinhood sent Alex another email and it said, "Oh, that $730,000 debt that we said you owed, that was a mistake. You don't owe anybody any money." The next and final story of today's episode is called The Sailor's Diagnosis. One morning in the summer of 1876, a doctor named Lewis Allard walked down the hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is an island east of Australia. Lewis was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open, and he looked over to see a few policemen walking in, carrying this unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from the looks of the way this guy was dressed, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. So a lot of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors because Papeete was a port town. So if people got sick or injured at sea and then docked in Papeete, they would come to the hospital right there. So Dr. Allard walked over to the police and asked them what was going on with the sailor. And the officers explained that this man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a very long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and then motioned for the police to follow him and bring this guy with him, and he led them over to an exam room where he had them lay out the sailor on a table so that Dr. Allard could look him over. The sailor appeared to be pretty young. He was in his 20s maybe, and he appeared very healthy and strong, but when the doctor checked for a pulse, there was none. And so after checking a couple more times to make sure it wasn't just a very weak pulse, the doctor ultimately concluded that, this sailor was not just unresponsive. The sailor was dead. And if Dr. Allard had to guess, he very likely died from alcohol poisoning, given his friends said, the night before, this guy had had a really heavy night of drinking, and here he was, so alcohol poisoning. So this hospital had a policy for how to handle the death of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Basically, the doctor who pronounced the sailor dead would then arrange for them to be buried in a public cemetery. And in fact, the hospital kept these cheap wooden coffins in the hospital morgue for this exact purpose. And so Dr. Allard followed protocol and asked the police to go inform the sailor's friends of his death, and then the doctor went to the hospital's morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was back in his office when he heard a knock at his door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door swung open, the doctor was surprised at who he saw there. It was the 4 local gravediggers who he had called earlier to bury that sailor who had just died. Now, generally speaking, Dr. Allard had virtually no interactions with the gravediggers after he hired them. He would tell them to bury the body, and they would do that and go on their separate way. Like there was no reason for the gravediggers to come back and check in with the doctor. But as the doctor is looking at these 4 guys trying to figure out what was going on here, he quickly assessed that, these guys weren't here just to chat. They were here because they looked spooked. And before Dr. Allard could ask any questions about, what was going on here, one of these gravediggers began to speak. And in sort of a rapid and sort of anxious tone, he said, as we were carrying the coffin over to the gravesite, it began to shake like the person inside the coffin was alive. And then we heard all these moaning sounds coming from inside of this nailed shut coffin. And we all got so panicked that we just dropped the coffin and we ran here to tell you. Now, Dr. Allard was pretty surprised by what he was hearing, but he's also thinking that, when he hired these 4 gravediggers, they were at a local pub and they were drinking. And so he's thinking to himself, maybe something strange happened, with this coffin, or much more likely, these 4 guys are drunk. And that what they've sort of said here is just some figment of their imagination, that they're not professional, they're just drunk guys who are coming here screwing up my day. And so sort of annoyed, Dr. Allard's like, hey, I'm telling you, that guy is dead, okay? This isn't a ghost scenario, but if you're so worried about it, why don't you go get a police officer, have them come over and inspect the coffin, make sure the person is really dead in there, and then once they confirm that, please do your job and bury this guy. And so the gravediggers, they kind of, look down sort of awkwardly and they're like, okay, we'll go do that. And they turned and they left. And then Dr. Allard got back to work. And then a few hours later, Dr. Allard heard another knock on his door. And this time when the door opened, it was a police officer. And it was actually the officer that the 4 gravediggers had gone and found at Dr. Allard's suggestion. And he had gone over, checked the coffin, and, the coffin wasn't moving, it wasn't making any weird sounds, it was sealed shut, there was nothing going on. And so the officer eventually instructed the gravediggers, to go ahead and bury it, there's nothing going on here. And so the gravediggers had, at that point, buried the coffin, and that had been that. And so the officer was here just to tell Dr. Allard that, hey, it's all good, he's buried, we can move on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had basically forgotten about this whole snafu around the coffin and whatever was going on with it. He was sort of on to the next thing, and he was out like he normally was at night to go for a walk. And the area that he liked to walk in the most was actually the cemetery. Not because he had some sort of morbid obsession, but because, it was often, vacant. There was nobody there. And so it was a peaceful place to go walking. And so, he's strolling through the cemetery like usual, and he's not seeing anybody like usual. But as it began to get dark, he was walking down this one row of headstones, and he looked up ahead, and he could have sworn he saw somebody standing behind a tree with their body sort of half out of the tree, half behind the tree, sort of half obscured. And he stopped, and he's looking, and the whole thing just sort of felt off. Like, what is this person doing? Is that a person? Like, what's going on here? And so he's staring, and as he's looking, sure enough, this dark silhouette steps out from behind this tree. And the way they stepped out, it was like they stepped out, turned, and faced Dr. Allard, and just stood there, clearly looking right at Dr. Allard. But they're pretty far away from Dr. Allard. Like, there's a good distance between them. But immediately, Dr. Allard felt threatened by this person, or whatever it was. He didn't even know if it was a person. He couldn't tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him or not. He's just staring at this thing that looked like it was looking at him. And so Dr. Allard instinctively, who's now feeling a little bit frightened, turned and just started walking away, like he was done walking in the cemetery for the night. And so he turns and he starts walking, but then it's like the hairs in the back of his neck stood up. He just felt like this person, whoever it is, they're still watching me. And so he stopped after just a couple of steps and he turned back around. And now this figure is clearly marching directly towards Dr. Allard. They're almost running. They're walking real fast right towards Dr. Allard. And so now Dr. Allard's terrified. He knows there's something happening here. Why would this person be doing this? Like, is it a person? Like, what's happening here? And so Dr. Allard, he turns and starts to run. And as he's running, he hears this horrible high-pitched scream echo across the entire cemetery. And then he looks back one last time and he sees the face of this figure, this person charging towards him. And it's the same guy who died a week ago, the same sailor that he buried, the one who presumably was moving around in the coffin the gravediggers were so scared of. It was him, and he jumped on Dr. Allard and began throttling him, and Dr. Allard's on the ground staring at this ghastly face. This scream is coming out of him. He had no idea what was going on, and then Dr. Allard just blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to, and he sat up suddenly, and he's looking around, and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, vacant cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor's ghost or whatever, or whoever it was. They're gone. And Dr. Allard's just sitting there, his heart's racing still, and he's telling himself, like, did that even just happen? Like, it felt so real. His neck was sore from, what he felt was this guy, this thing attacking him. But at the same time, he was so sure that the face that he had seen on this person was the dead sailor's face. But how could that be? He's dead. He's buried. How could that be? And so ultimately, Dr. Allard, he got up and he hustled back to his house. But over the coming weeks, Dr. Allard sort of spiraled into madness because it was like every day, all the time, he would see out of the corner of his eye for a second, like a glimpse of this dead sailor's ghost. And it was always that face, that ghastly face, that shrieking face looking right at him. And he'd turn and, the face would disappear. But Dr. Allard, he just felt like he was almost being haunted, that something had happened, like that attack in the cemetery. It had felt so real. He felt like now this ghost was literally haunting him, but he couldn't tell anyone. I mean, he's a doctor. What's he gonna do? Tell people that a ghost is haunting him? He didn't know what to do. And so what he ended up doing after several weeks is he just began staying home and laying in bed, basically feigning illness to avoid leaving the house. And he would just lay there with his eyes closed basically all day, because as soon as he opened his eyes, he would see this dead sailor's face. He really was losing his mind. And then eventually, when Dr. Allard knew he had to stop basically staying in bed all day and go back to the hospital and sort of function in society again, go back to work, otherwise people were going to start asking questions here, like, what's going on with you? And he didn't have an answer, When that time came and he knew it was sort of like, okay, go back to normal or tell people about this. Well, what Dr. Allard ultimately did is he decided to walk up to the roof of his house and throw himself off. He literally couldn't live with what he believed was this ghost haunting him 24/7. When the doctor's close friends found out that the doctor had taken his own life, they immediately went to the police and said, hey, wait a minute, we think this has something to do with what he was dealing with over the past several weeks. So the doctor, despite not wanting to tell anybody about, his haunting, he did sort of begin to tell a couple of his close friends. Now, he was sort of subtle about it, but he began telling people that he's like, yeah, I just keep seeing that dead sailor's face everywhere I go. I just keep seeing him. Now, he didn't highlight the fact that he was basically losing his mind over it and thought it was literally a ghost, but a couple of his close friends were aware that it almost seemed like, Dr. Allard was effectively having a mental breakdown over this dead sailor. And they did sort of connect that Dr. Allard sort of felt haunted by this dead sailor. And so, said close friends ultimately went to the police and said, hey, I know this is a stretch, but the doctor kind of thought he was being haunted by this dead sailor before he died. We think that has to do with why he took his own life. And sort of amazingly, the police, the way they responded to this was, okay, we're gonna look into this. We're gonna investigate the haunting, so to speak. And what they did is they exhumed the coffin of that dead sailor. They didn't know what else to do. They just decided they would do that. And so they raise the coffin out of the ground and they open it up and they cannot believe what they see. So it would turn out those 4 gravediggers had been totally justified in being scared about what they thought they heard and felt in that coffin when they were going to bury it. Because the sailor was not dead. He was just so drunk that it felt like he was dead. They couldn't feel his pulse. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was not dead. He was totally alive. And so as he was being carried over to the gravesite to be buried, he really was moving around inside the coffin and moaning because he was horribly hungover, but totally alive and, grappling with the fact that he's now, confined inside of this coffin. He likely had no idea what was going on. So you can imagine the types of sounds and things he might be doing. And so the gravediggers, they were right to be scared. They did get a police officer. The police officer came over, and for whatever reason, when he inspected the coffin, he saw it was sealed. There was no movement inside the coffin. It was totally quiet. So, the sailor inside, he just wasn't moving or making any sound. And so the police officer greenlit burying him. So the living sailor inside the coffin is buried underground by these gravediggers, and they go their separate ways afterwards. But then that sailor wakes up again. He begins thrashing around after being buried in the ground, and he actually managed to break out of the coffin and climb out of the ground. He saved himself. He literally, survived being buried alive. But he was furious at the doctor, who so cavalierly just decided he was dead and now go bury him. And so he decided he would play a prank on the doctor to get back at him. So what he did is he filled his coffin up with rocks and he sealed it back up and he reburied it so nobody would know anything. And then for the next week or so, he just kind of hid out and didn't let anybody know that he was actually still alive. And then, after about a week, he knew the doctor took his walks in that cemetery, and so he hid behind a tree in the cemetery and waited for the doctor to be alone making his walk. And when he saw him, it was the sailor, fully alive in the flesh, stepping out from behind the tree, looking at the doctor. That was him. It really was the sailor. And he really did run forward, shrieking, pretending to be a ghost. And he attacked Dr. Allard, basically giving him the impression that his angry ghost was attacking him. And then after Dr. Allard passed out on the ground, the sailor ran off. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed that sailor was dead, can you imagine what he thought when he saw, the sailor attacking him and shrieking in the middle of the cemetery? He fully believed that was the sailor's ghost, and he had this totally real experience getting attacked by the ghost. And so even though he survived the encounter, It drove him mad. He began seeing the dead sailor, the ghost, everywhere he went, and it eventually drove him to kill himself. And so when the police opened up that coffin, all they saw were all the rocks the sailor had left behind. But following the doctor's suicide, that sailor apparently skipped town and was never seen again. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 4 stories that all demonstrate how one seemingly small action can have massive ripple effects on the future. The audio from all 4 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Orange Juice, and it's about how a bottle of orange juice changed one man's life forever. The second story you'll hear is called Overcoming Adversity, and it might be one of the greatest revenge stories of all time. The third story you'll hear is called Cowboy, and it's about a beloved Hollywood icon who has a surprisingly dark past. And the fourth and final story you'll hear today is called Pick Your Poison, and it's about a very sick person who inadvertently becomes the test subject in a highly controversial experiment. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're visiting the Amazon Music follow button at their house, be sure to go into their bathroom and rub poison ivy all over their toilet paper. Okay, let's get into our first story called Orange Juice. In 2018, a 56-year-old father of 4 named Tayeb Suyami was living in a quiet, modest town in New Jersey called Little Ferry. Tayeb had moved to the United States from Africa back in 1996, and after getting settled in New Jersey, he had landed a job as an accountant for a food importing company. At first, Tayeb's salary had been enough to provide for the family, but as his family grew, his salary just wasn't enough, and money became a real problem. And so eventually, Tayeb's wife also got a full-time job, but even then, with 2 full-time working adults, the family had to stay on a very strict budget just to make ends meet. And that year, in 2018, one of Tayeb's daughters was getting ready to go to college, and so Tayeb was forced to refinance his mortgage just to make the initial payments on his child's college bills. But despite his financial struggles, Tayeb did not let it bother him. He was an eternal optimist who fundamentally believed that in the end, everything would just work itself out. On May 1st of that year, Tayyab was on his way home from work when his wife called him and asked if he would swing by the grocery store and pick up some orange juice. So Tayyab stopped at the ShopRite grocery store in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was only a couple miles north of Little Ferry where they lived. And he went inside, he went to the juice aisle, and he scanned the different brands of orange juice. And at some point, he grabbed the most appealing orange juice that was still within their budget. It was $5. He takes the juice, he goes to the front of the store, he pays for it, he goes outside, he hops in his car, and he heads home. When he pulls into his driveway, he gets out, he goes into the house, he goes right into the kitchen where his wife was, and he proudly set the orange juice down on the kitchen table, expecting a thank you from his wife. But his wife turned around and she looked at the orange juice and she saw the brand he had purchased, and she immediately said, "How much did you pay for that?" And Tayyab said, $5. And she said, "Well, you got to take it back because I know that brand is on sale for $2.50 at the grocery store right down the road. So go return this one." And so Tayyab was totally annoyed because he just got home from work. He thought he had done a good deed and now he's in trouble. And so he decided, you know what? I'm not going to fight her on this. He just walked over, grabbed the $5 orange juice, and he went back outside, hopped in his car, and took off. A few minutes later, he arrived at the Hackensack, New Jersey ShopRite. He went inside and he went straight to the customer service desk where there was a teenager behind the counter. And Tayyab walked over to them and he handed them the juice along with his receipt, and he asked for a refund. And so while Tayyab is standing there letting this cashier complete the transaction, he looked behind the cashier at the wall, and there was this sign that totally piqued his interest. And so he's staring at the sign, and then finally the teenage cashier, he finishes the transaction and he reaches out across the counter with Tayyab's $5. And Tayyab, he reaches out and he takes the $5, but then he pauses for a second. And he's kind of looking up at the sign and he's thinking about what he should do. And he knows that if he does this, if he does what the sign is telling him to do, he's going to get in trouble with his wife because this is the exact opposite of what he was sent out to do. But Tayyab just couldn't help it, and he takes the $5 and he proceeds to hand it right back to the cashier, and he tells the cashier what he wants him to do with it. And so a couple minutes later, Tayyab leaves the ShopRite with no juice, with no $5, but 2 small slips of paper in his back pocket. And so Tayyab hops in his car and he drives to the grocery store that's right down the road from their house. He goes inside and he gets the on sale $2.50 bottle of orange juice. And then he goes back into his car, he drives home, he goes in the kitchen and he sets the juice on the counter and tells his wife, "Yep, I got the right one, $2.50. And he's just hoping the whole time that she has not checked the bank account and has not discovered what he had really been doing while he was out, because he had actually spent more money on the second trip than the first time. But apparently his wife had not checked the account yet, and she just thanked him for being willing to go out and get the better deal. And so Tayyab very happily left the kitchen, and he spent the rest of the night watching TV and hanging out with his family. And then early the next morning, Tayyab got up and he decided, you know what? I need to do something to curry some favor with my wife because she's gonna learn what I did with the refund money pretty soon. And so he decided he would just go out and do a bunch of yard work that day, right in front of his wife, to make sure she really saw that he was doing some good stuff. And so he goes outside, he opens up the garage, and he's about to pull the lawnmower out when he notices his car is really dirty. And so he decides, you know what, I'm gonna go wash my car first and then come back and cut the grass and do some other things. And so he goes inside and he tells his wife what his plan is, and she says, okay, I'll see you in a little bit when you come back from the car wash. And then Tayyab went back outside, he hopped in his car, and he left. As he was driving to the car wash, he made a pit stop at a small store that was set back off the road. And so he goes inside and he goes right to the back of this little store where there's this strange machine that looks like an ATM, and it has a screen on it with text scrolling across it. And at the bottom, there was an opening where a barcode scanner was kind of projecting down. And so Tayyab walks up to this machine and he reaches into his back pocket and he pulls out those 2 slips of paper he had got from the grocery store cashier the night before, and he puts the first one under the scanner, and then he reads the text that appears on the screen of this machine. And after reading it, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and puts that piece of paper back in his pocket. And then the second slip of paper he puts into the scanner. And then when he reads the words that pop up on the screen, he thinks there's been a mistake because all it says is "see receptionist." And so he rescans the second slip of paper to see if something different will happen. But sure enough, again, it just says "see receptionist." And so he pulls the second slip of paper out of the scanner, he turns around and he walks to the front of the store and he hands the paper to the woman behind the counter. Over an hour later, Tayyab pulled into his driveway, and he sat in his driveway for a second. He was still shaking from what had just happened inside of that small store. So he gets out of his car, which was still totally dirty, and he made his way into the house, and he went straight to the kitchen where his wife was. And so as soon as he gets in the kitchen, his wife turns around and looks at him and says, "Where were you? The car wash is like 5 minutes away. Why were you gone for like 2 hours?" But Tayyab, he's got no expression on his face, and he looks at his wife and just says, "Give me $100. And his wife scrunches her face up at him and says, "No, where's your money?" And Tayyab smiles, he turns around, he reaches into his back pocket, and he pulls out that second slip of paper, and he hands it to his wife, and he says, "Here's my money." After getting that $5 refund at the ShopRite in Hackensack, New Jersey, Tayyab noticed a sign on the back wall that was advertising for a Moneyball jackpot lottery. And he had decided to use the $5 refund to buy 2 lottery tickets. And so he buys these 2 lottery tickets, and the next day, that store set back off the road he went to was a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, and the machine he was using was a machine that scanned your lottery tickets to see if they were winners. And so the first ticket he scanned, it was a dud, it didn't win anything. But the second ticket, when he scanned it, it couldn't process the amount of money he had just won. And so that's why it told him to see the receptionist. And so he brought the second ticket up to the counter, he handed it to the woman, and after she scanned it and saw the amount of money he had won, all she could do was say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And when he asked her, "What are you looking at? What happened?" She just goes, "Big." And so when he got home, Tayyab handed that slip to his wife, and on it was the amount of money that he had won. He was the jackpot winner. He had won $315 million. Tayyab would say that he and his wife and his kids all laughed and cried and celebrated in the kitchen all night. And within a couple of days, Tayyab had left his job, he retired, and he had paid off all of his family's debts. And at his press conference for the New Jersey lottery, he was quoted as saying, "I love orange juice now." Our next story is called Overcoming Adversity. In 1959, Ronald McNair was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy living in South Carolina. While he was good at virtually everything he tried, from music to athletics to schoolwork, the only thing that ever really grabbed his attention was outer space. And so as a 9-year-old child, he made the decision that one day he was going to become an astronaut. But he had no idea how to become an astronaut. And so he decided the first thing he would do would be to go to his library and take out some books on NASA, the very famous organization that sends American astronauts to space. However, there was an issue with his plan. This library only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this, but he figured, you know what? I'm a polite kid. I can get in there and get out before anybody notices me. But as soon as he walked into that library, everybody in there, who were all white, just stared at Ronald. Ronald could feel it, but he just kept his head down and he walked through the library. He got to the science section. He grabbed a couple books he wanted, and then he walked back to the counter and he put them up, and he very politely asked the librarian, who was also white, if he could check these books out. And this librarian looks at him and says, "Young man, you better get out of here before I call the police." And Ronald, at this point, looks up at the librarian and thinks for a second, and then just hops up onto her counter and sits there and says, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged and would call the police and would call Ronald's mother. And before long, the police did show up, and it was 2 white guys. They come inside, and this librarian runs over to them, and she's talking to them, and she's pointing back over at Ronald, gesticulating that very clearly Ronald is the issue. That's why you've been called here. And the officers would be just totally annoyed by this librarian. And they would say to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" And the librarian was totally offended at this and began defending her decision to call the police instead of letting him take the books out. And as she's defending herself, Ronald's mother comes running into the library. She runs over to her son to make sure he's okay. And then she looks up at the police officers and this librarian to try to figure out what's going on. And at this point, the police officers are just totally over it. And they turn to the librarian and they say, "You know what? You really ought to let him take the books out." And then the officers just turned around and left. The librarian was not about to just let him take the books. She was still very upset. And so she storms over to Ronald's mother and she says to her, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." And at this, Ronald's mother is looking at this librarian who's totally upset, and she looks down at her son who's got his head down, and then she notices the few books on the counter about space, and she was aware of Ronald's love for outer space, and she put together what had happened. And after thinking about it for a moment, she looks up at this librarian, and she just says, well, since he's here already, can he take out those books? He'll take good care of them. The librarian is still totally furious, but knows this is a losing fight, and so very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabs the books and she jams them into Ronald's arms. And Ronald's mother nudges Ronald and says, what do you say? And Ronald, while holding all of his new books about NASA and space, looks up at the librarian and smiles and says, thank you, ma'am. And then he and his mom turn around and they leave. Ronald would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and after graduation, he was picked up by NASA to become an astronaut. And in 1984, Ronald went into outer space. He was actually the second African American to ever go into outer space. And while he was in orbit, apparently he played his saxophone for his crew. And then in 1986, Ronald was chosen again to go on another mission to outer space, but tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, their space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. Following his death, the library in South Carolina that had tried to turn Ronald away for his skin color renamed themselves the Ronald McNair Life History Center. Our next story is called Cowboy. In 1963, when Tim Dick was just 10 years old, he went over to his friend's house and he snuck a bottle of whiskey from one of their shelves. He pulled it out and he poured himself a full glass to the brim with whiskey, and then he downed it in one huge gulp. Tim had grown up idolizing cowboys on TV, and every time he watched them, they would come galloping into some town, they would go into the saloon, and they would sit at the bar just throwing back shots of whiskey. And so Tim always assumed whiskey must be this totally amazing, refreshing drink for these guys to be drinking it out in the heat of the desert. But unfortunately for Tim, after he slugged this huge glass of whiskey, it was not refreshing. It tasted like gasoline, and his chest felt like it was on fire. But instead of being turned off by alcohol and waiting until he was older and of age to try it again, Tim instead thought, you know what? The next time I have whiskey, I just need to water it down a little bit. And so for the next year, Tim continued to periodically sneak whiskey out of his friends' cabinets, and he would drink this watered down whiskey. And then when he turned 11 years old, his father, who he was very close with, died tragically in a car accident. And Tim really didn't have a good way to cope with the grief of losing his father, and so he turned to drinking even more than he already was. And before long, Tim was like this young kid who basically was an alcoholic. But he hid it extremely well. He graduated high school, he graduated college, and really nobody knew he was drinking as much as he was. But after he graduated college and he was living on his own in Michigan, there was no structure in place or person in place to stop Tim from going overboard with his substance abuse. And so not only did his drinking get completely out of control, but he began using and selling drugs, namely cocaine. In 1978, when Tim was 25 years old, he and his drug dealing partner were scheduled to take part in the biggest drug deal of their careers. They would be selling about 1.5 pounds of cocaine to a guy named Michael Pfeiffer, and he'd be buying it for $42,000, which when you adjust that for inflation would be like buying it for $175,000 in 2021. Tim and his partner were very excited about all this money they were going to make, but they were equally worried about the transaction. A lot can go wrong. And so Tim decided, in order to mitigate their nerves and kind of make this a safer drug deal, he decided they would do the transaction inside of a public airport, because Tim had seen that done on TV and believed that would give them an additional layer of safety. And so on the day this deal is going to take place, Tim takes the 1.5 pounds of cocaine, he puts it inside of a brown Adidas gym bag, and he also throws a key lock inside of this bag. He zips it up, he walks outside, he dumps the bag in the back of his car, and he drives to the Kalamazoo International Airport in Michigan. When he gets there, he parks in the big parking lot right outside of the front doors. And as soon as he's parked, he goes around to the back of his car. He pulls out this brown Adidas bag. He throws it over his shoulder, shuts his trunk, and then he waits for his partner to show up. A couple of minutes later, right on time, his partner pulls into the lot, he parks nearby, and then the two of them very casually begin walking towards the front doors of this airport. They walk up the steps, they go in the front doors, and as soon as they're inside, they're looking around, and they find Michael Pfeiffer. He's standing up against the wall right in the area he had said he would be. And so without making any sort of contact with Michael, Tim and his partner turn the corner, and they go into a nearby locker room. Once they're inside, Tim pulls the lock out of the brown bag, and then he puts the bag with the drugs in it inside of a locker. He shuts it and then uses the lock he had just pulled out to lock the locker. And then he and his partner leave the locker room. As soon as they go out into the main terminal, they start walking over towards Michael Pfeiffer. And as they get closer and closer, Tim's partner breaks off and goes to a bench on the other side of the terminal. And Tim continues walking on right up to Michael. And then when he reaches Michael, he very discreetly hands him the key to the lock on the locker. And he tells him which locker number the drugs are in. Michael doesn't say anything. He takes the key and he heads off to the locker room. Tim turns and he goes over to his partner and he sits down on the bench and waits. Meanwhile, Michael goes inside the locker room. He uses the key. He opens up the lock. He opens the locker up. He checks to make sure the drugs are still there. They are. As soon as that's confirmed, he takes the bag, he throws it over his shoulder, and he walks back out to the main terminal to meet up with Tim and his partner. Tim and his partner are sitting on the bench. They see Michael coming out of the locker room, and they're expecting Michael to walk over and basically hand them a bag full of $42,000. But instead, Michael walks up to them and draws a gun and points it at them and says, "I'm a police officer. You're under arrest." It would turn out this was a sting operation. Michael Pfeiffer, the undercover police officer, had been following around Tim and his partner for months. In Michigan at the time, if you were caught trying to sell 650 grams or more of cocaine, there was an automatic penalty of a life sentence. And Tim and his partner had just been arrested trying to sell more than 650 grams of cocaine. And so facing a life sentence, Tim took a deal that gave him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other drug dealers. And so Tim would ultimately serve 2 years and 4 months in a federal penitentiary before he was released. Tim would say his time in prison was absolutely miserable, but it was necessary. It matured him in a major way, and it honed his sense of humor. Tim was always a very funny guy. He was always the class clown and the guy goofing around. But in prison, he found it a very difficult task to get these hardened prisoners and prison guards to laugh at his jokes. But eventually, with enough practice and repetition, he could get anybody in that prison to laugh at him. And so by the time he got out, he was like an amazing comedian. And so he decided, you know what? Why don't I pursue a career in comedy? 4 years later, Tim Dick, better known as Tim Allen, landed the starring role on the hit TV show Home Improvement. And from there, he starred in dozens more movies and TV shows, but he's probably best known for his voice acting in the very popular movie series Toy Story, where he plays Buzz Lightyear. Today, Tim is sober and has been for decades. The next and final story of today's episode is called Pick Your Poison. On June 14th, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of 3 had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own, her mind was kind of always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, But the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her. And just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed the bee was still there, and worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye, and Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis, or fibromyalgia, or MS, or heart failure, or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, I think I have Lyme disease, they said, yep, you do, but now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you. And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease. And then eventually her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of Ellie's life. The pain was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. Even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die. And so she figured, with these bee stings, I'm going to have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's going to take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about how a single decision changed the lives of people in these stories, as well as millions of other lives around the world. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called One Man's Trash, and it's about a woman who finds something incredible in her husband's office trash can that would change their lives forever. The second story you'll hear is called Accidental Superstar, and it's about a man who has a completely normal career, but then something totally random happens that changes everything. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Shiner, and it's about a man who gets into a fight at a McDonald's restaurant the night before his big job interview. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their very expensive and nice knives in their butcher's block with plastic cutlery. Okay, let's get into our first story called One Man's Trash. One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers, but they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but, for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts, and then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications, and the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside, but as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before, like this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before, and so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away, and she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, like, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And two, again, this is so good, why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, like, this is so good, what's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, like, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, like, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No, this is the one. This is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You got to see it through. It's too good not to." And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, "Not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance," which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story that Tabby saved from the trash can would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. Our next story is called Accidental Superstar. In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, and he'd always been pretty shy, and so he figured this class might be able to help him get over that. But this class wound up having a much larger impact on Harry's life than he ever could have imagined. Not only did he meet his future wife in this class, but he also realized he loved acting, something he never thought he would like, and he decided after college that that was the thing he was going to pursue. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, which is basically this program that's designed to help new actors and actresses get parts in Hollywood because it's so hard to do that. And so he's accepted into this program, he signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing, and right away they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. Nobody. The only roles he was getting were incredibly minor and usually non-speaking, and so it was really not advancing his career. Then, in 1966, so 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, Harry received what seemed like his first big break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. It was a 60-second bit where Harry basically walked on screen in this hotel, and he started calling out for a particular guest, and when he finds this guest, he walks up and gives him a piece of paper, and then he leaves. So it's a forgettable scene, but it's a real scene in a real movie. And so this was a big deal for Harry. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, he goes back over to the headquarters of the New Talent Program at Columbia Pictures. And as soon as he goes inside, one of the producers that was in charge of this New Talent Program, who had apparently had a chance already to see this 60-second scene in this movie that Harry was in, he calls Harry over and asks him to go up to his office for a second. So the pair go up to his office, they both sit down, and the guy looks at him and says, "Look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star." When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away, as he's carrying those groceries, that guy, he's gonna be a movie star. You could see it in the scene, even though all he was doing was carrying groceries. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. You don't have the X factor. You're not going to be a movie star. For reference, Tony Curtis, the guy this producer was referencing, was a huge movie star in the 1950s and 1960s. And so Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, he pauses for a second, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, "You know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star?" And at this totally smart aleck remark, the producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar New Talent Program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. And the feedback he finally got was, "Harry, you're just not pretty enough, and you're not really that talented." By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was making almost no money from acting. And so he decided, instead of acting, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job. Despite the fact he knew nothing about carpentry. And so he literally, just because he has this interest in carpentry, goes to the library and checks out all these how to be a carpenter books. And over the next couple of weeks, he studies these books and does a couple projects around his own house. And then finally, he just felt confident enough, or he was just desperate enough for money, that he began going around to his network and asking people in Hollywood if they needed some woodworking, if they needed help from a carpenter. And surprisingly, lots of people took him up on his offer and they hired him to be their carpenter. And before long, Harry was dubbed the Carpenter to the Stars, which was kind of ironic because he actually was not a very good carpenter, and he was regularly seen on the job, literally holding a book, teaching him how to be a carpenter while doing the carpentry with his other hand. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. Now, at this point, Harry was not looking for any more acting roles. He kind of figured that ship has sailed, even though he wishes he could be an actor. At this point, he had a wife, he had 2 sons, and so he's thinking, I gotta just keep doing this carpentry thing because I gotta pay the bills. So he says to Fred, I appreciate the offer of whatever this is, but if it has to do with acting, I'm just not interested. And Fred, who was one of the very few people in Hollywood who fundamentally believed Harry was destined to be a star, told Harry, no, this is different. This is not a pure go out and try out for the part and hope for the best. This is like put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so Harry's like, okay, tell me about this opportunity. I'm interested. And so Fred explained there was this really talented and eccentric film director who was trying to cast an upcoming movie. And the way he went about casting for movies was a little bit strange. Instead of having each of the actors and actresses show up and individually audition for their parts, he would group batches of actors and actresses, and he would have them audition as a group, because that way he could tell if there was chemistry amongst some of the actors and actresses, and he could gauge their individual talent. And so he had all these groups already planned out, but one of the groups was missing one male actor. Somebody had dropped out at the last minute and was not going to be there on the day of the audition. And so when Fred Roos heard through the grapevine that this director was going to be short this one person, he immediately reached out to the director and said, "Hey, I got your guy. There's this guy, Harry. He's done a little bit of acting. He's incredibly talented. You got to give him a chance. At the minimum, he can come in there and he can at least just read the lines and help you do this audition. But I know he's available that day and I know he would love to help." And so this director tells Fred, "Okay, thank you. I'd love to have him come down, but stress to him, he is not auditioning for any part in this movie. I'm not bringing in some person and just throwing them in. It takes me a long time to find people that I want to audition, and he is not one of them. He is just there to facilitate the audition. He's just going to read the lines so the other people in his group can do their audition." And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was annoyed that Fred had basically already volunteered him, and so he couldn't really even say no without making Fred look bad. And he didn't like the idea that this was basically a waste of his time. He was being asked to go read lines, but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? But Fred told him, "Look, worst case scenario, you meet some pretty powerful people in Hollywood. This director's a big deal. The people there are going to be big deals in Hollywood. So you'll meet them and maybe they will recognize your talent. Or maybe you get some new clients for your carpentry business. So no matter what, you get something out of it." And so finally, Harry says, "Okay, fine, I'll go do this thing." And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. Don't try to act, just read the lines. I don't care if you're monotone, you just read these lines because you're not auditioning. Everybody else is, you're not. Is that clear? And Harry's like, "Yes, I get it. I'm just reading the lines." And so Harry sits down and he starts reading the lines, and he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. He started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. He was just totally bitter that he was in the situation he was in. And apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. That kind of nonchalant, bravado, macho, alpha type guy who just didn't care about anybody. And so over the course of the day, as he's reading the script over and over again, not caring at all about how he's performing, he's just simply reading these lines and just being himself. He was actually doing this amazing job portraying one of the characters. And so they let Harry go the whole day. No one told him they were looking at him as a potential character. And then at the end of the day, when Harry was about to just throw the script in the trash and leave without talking to anyone, the film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, "Wait a minute, I was wrong. You are perfect for this movie, Star Wars. You need to play Han Solo." And so Harrison Ford said, "All right, I'll play Han Solo." And that role as Han Solo propelled Harrison Ford into the megastar that we know him as today. A few years after Harrison had starred in Star Wars and he was this total A-list celebrity, he was at a Hollywood studio in one of their restaurants when one of the waiters walked over to him with this silver tray, and on this silver tray was a single business card. So Harrison reaches over, he grabs the business card, the waiter walks away, and he looks at the card, and handwritten on it is the phrase, "I missed my bet." And he flipped the card over, and it was the name of that producer from the new talent program that had called Harry into his office and said, "You're never going to make it in Hollywood and you're fired." It was that guy, and he had apparently sent the waiter over to make amends because he was eating lunch in the same restaurant. And so Harrison would later say in interviews that at the time he got this card, and to this day that he was doing this interview, he said it gave him immense pleasure that when he looked up from this business card and he understood the situation, he knows this guy's in the room somewhere. As he looked around the room, he couldn't recognize the guy because he didn't know what he looked like. He was a nobody. And so instead of wasting any more time looking for this producer, he just looked at the card, chucked it, and went back to eating his lunch. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Shiner. One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do, and so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, "Is this okay?" And she kind of looked back and smiled like, "I get it, it's fine, we can eat here." So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table, and then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, "Hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here." And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, "Sure, go ahead." And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't, and so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and, focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview and he looks at this guy and he's like, "What's going on?" Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date. Insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, "What's going on here?" He's looking at his date like, "Did I miss something?" Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, "You're an ugly pig." And at this, Chris is like, "I can't just sit here." And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, "Hey man, get up." Like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here. And he kind of looks up at this guy and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point and he kept apologizing to his date and she's like, "No, it's fine." And they just wanted to get out of there. And so they left the McDonald's and they both, went to their respective homes and Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning when Chris got up early because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? "Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night." There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, "You know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome." And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good. But it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity, and he left thinking, I'm not going to get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye. Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights. And they're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines. He's got the charisma. And look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. I mean, he truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that all demonstrate how one seemingly small action can have massive ripple effects in the future. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Skills, and it's about an aspiring teacher who is forced to make an emotional decision. The second story you'll hear is called Crash, and it's about a college student who does not realize the significance of some photos he took. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Wires Crossed, and it's about a timeline-altering event that forever changes the course of American history. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please transfer all of the Follow Buttons Bitcoin to your untraceable offshore account. Okay, let's get into our first story called Skills. In 1971, a 19-year-old Irishman named William began studying physics and computer science at a university in Belfast, Northern Ireland. While he was certainly smart enough to complete the 4-year degree, after 1 year of being in this school, he decided to drop out because he felt like this was not the path he wanted to be on. So he moved back home to a town about 30 minutes north of Belfast, where he got a job as a forklift driver and truck driver for the Guinness Beer Factory. And while he loved this job, he still felt like this was not the path for him. He needed to do something more with his life. And so he decided he would pursue what two of his siblings had gone on to do, which was to become a school teacher. He had always admired his school teachers growing up, and he idolized his two siblings that had become teachers, and so it felt like the right fit. And so William applied to a 4-year teaching college in Newcastle in England, and after he was accepted, he flew to England, he got set up, and then he began his studies. The first year was great. He loved what he was doing, he did feel like this was the right fit, and he was getting good grades, everything was going exactly to plan. But then year 2 happened, and everything went off the rails. A requirement to graduate from this 4-year teaching college was all the aspiring teachers starting in their second year had to go teach real students real lessons. They basically had to go to high schools and elementary schools and fill in for the real teacher and give a real lesson. And they were scored on their ability to do that. But all the aspiring teachers knew that when you gave these real lessons to real students, what really ended up happening was the students did not take the aspiring teachers seriously. They viewed them as kind of like substitute teachers, and so they didn't respect them and they didn't listen to them. And so typically, these real teaching sessions just turned into the aspiring teachers desperately trying to calm down their pupils long enough to get them to listen to their lesson plan for just 1 second. But normally it didn't work out, and before long the day was over and nothing was really accomplished. So in William's second year, when it was his turn to go over to a high school and administer his lesson plan, he went over there knowing what he was up against. He did not really expect it to go well, but he decided he would go in there with a positive attitude and he would try to do his best. But as soon as he walked into his classroom, he immediately could tell he was going to be overwhelmed. Everybody's standing up and talking amongst themselves, and they turn around and they see William walking in, and they have this moment of realization that their real teacher is not going to be teaching them that day. It's going to be this substitute, William, and they all kind of gleefully began laughing and joking, and they just turned their backs on William and kept talking amongst themselves. And so William goes inside, he puts his stuff on the desk, and he attempts to get the class to listen to him by saying, "Hey everyone, come on, sit down, time to listen up, I'm your new teacher for the day." But the kids just were not listening. And so finally, William, who was a really big guy, he was 6'4", he was in great shape, he kind of postured himself and then yelled at the class, "Sit down right now." And at this, the class did turn around and looked at William and kind of sized him up, and most of them decided, okay, it's time to sit down. And so 99% of the class goes quiet and sits down, except for one kid. It was this 15-year-old boy who was at the back of the room, and he was standing up, defiant, with his arms crossed, staring at William with a smirk on his face. And all around him, all his cronies were sitting down, looking up at him, laughing, and kind of looking up at William and laughing at him, knowing that a confrontation was about to ensue. And so William is staring at this kid, trying to get him to just sit without saying anything, and this kid is just mean mugging him with his arms crossed, and nothing's happening. And so William walks right up to him and kind of leans over his shoulder and says, "You need to go out in the hallway right now, I will meet you out there." And then William turned around and started walking back towards the front of the room, expecting this to have worked, that this 15-year-old kid would have just followed right along and he'd walk right out to the hallway and that would be that. But when he turned back around again, the 15-year-old kid had not moved. He was still standing in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, staring up at William, basically saying, "Make me." And at this, William lost his mind. He was so mad and so frustrated at how unbelievably disrespectful this kid was being, and really the whole class was being to him, that he just kind of lost it. And he ran up to this kid in the back of the room and he gets right up in his face. And remember, William is 6'4". He's a big guy. And he gets right in the kid's face and he's like, "Get out in the hall right now." And this kid doesn't flinch. Instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a knife and he holds it right up against William. And William, without any hesitation, just winds up and blasts this kid across the side of the head, sending him flying over a kid sitting at a desk. He goes flying over this kid and crumples into the corner. And then when he stands up, he drops the knife and puts his hands up and he's like, okay, I'll go out in the hall. And William's like, go out in the hall right now. And so the kid ran out of the classroom, he goes out into the hall, and the whole class is totally silent. No one even wants to look up at William. They're all kind of just looking down at their desk, trying to be as quiet as possible. And William walks back to the front of the class and proceeds to teach the rest of the lesson. As soon as the high school learned that this aspiring teacher, William, had basically knocked out one of their students, even though it seemed like it might have been a little bit deserved, they immediately told the teacher's college, and the teacher's college immediately expelled William. And so now William is suddenly jobless and he's kind of lost again in the world. He doesn't know what he wants to do now because he really had committed to being a teacher. And so he goes back to his home in Northern Ireland and he begins thinking about, what is he going to do next? And he keeps having this thought that he should pursue this thing that he's always been interested in, but he had never taken seriously because it felt so risky. But now that basically everything in his life had fallen apart, he had nothing to lose. So he decided, what the heck, I will do the thing that I've always wanted to do. And that was stage acting. And so he went and auditioned with a local theater company in Belfast. He was accepted into the theater troupe. And then 4 years later, he was discovered performing on stage by a Hollywood filmmaker. And they cast him in a movie. And the rest, as they say, is history. William Neeson, better known as Liam Neeson, would go on to star in dozens of huge movies and TV shows, and he's probably best known for his epic role in the movie Taken, where he is this CIA operative with a particular set of skills, and in this movie, he punches a lot of people in the face, just like when he was a teacher. Our next story is called Crash. Cranbrook, which is a small, snowy town in British Columbia, Canada, used to be a place no one had heard of. Then Isaiah Otieno changed that. In 2006, an 18-year-old smiling young man named Isaiah Otieno stepped off of a plane in Cranbrook and began making his way toward the baggage claim. As he walked, everyone in the airport stopped and stared up at him. Isaiah was 6'9" tall, and he was from Kenya, making him easily one of the most unique people in all of Cranbrook. Isaiah, who was the son of a Kenyan politician, had worked really hard to earn his slot at the local university, called the College of the Rockies. His plan was to use that degree to get a great job so he could help support his family back in Nairobi. Not long after the first semester of Isaiah's freshman year had started, he was not only flourishing academically, but also socially. His big smile and his charm and his incredibly good manners had earned him many friends as well as the nickname the Gentle Giant. But the person Isaiah most closely bonded with while he was in Cranbrook was another student named Isaac Hockley. Isaac, in addition to being a student at the College of the Rockies, was also a passionate photographer and actually worked part-time for the local newspaper as a freelance photographer. Isaac and Isaiah had briefly met in late 2006 at their campus's billiard halls when they were both playing pool, but that interaction had not made them friends. What had cemented their friendship and made them very, very close was one night in early 2007, Isaiah had gotten a job as a bouncer at a local bar because he's 6'9", and so he was the bouncer. And Isaac had come to that bar, not to see Isaiah, just to go to the bar. And so Isaiah's at the front, he's checking people in, and then he hears this commotion in the bar behind him, and he turns and he sees Isaac is getting attacked by this huge guy that's way stronger than him, who looked like he was the aggressor in the fight. And so without any hesitation, Isaiah turns and just starts galloping into the bar. He's leaping over chairs, he's leaping over tables, and he jumps into the fray, and he fought off Isaac's attacker. And so after the dust settled, Isaac was so thankful for Isaiah, even though Isaiah kind of downplayed it and acted like it was no big deal. But either way, the experience totally bonded these two very different people, and after that, they became totally inseparable. Over the next couple of semesters, the pair would often go off on long rides outside of Cranbrook into the mountains and the forests, and they would just chat. Isaiah would talk about what it was like to live in Kenya and how he was really here to try to be successful like his father. And Isaac would talk to Isaiah about his passion for photography and what it was like growing up in Canada around Cranbrook. On one very memorable drive, the pair were driving at night along this kind of winding road that went through a forest when all of a sudden a moose leapt onto the road and blocked their way. And so Isaac at the last second had to swerve to avoid the moose. But ultimately, they did not get into an accident and it was just a close call. So Isaac was totally fine. He had kind of recovered within seconds of getting past the moose, but Isaiah, who was in the passenger seat, was totally shaken up by it. And when Isaac started talking to Isaiah about why he was so shaken up, because after all, they are fine, they did not get into an accident, Isaiah would admit that he wasn't shaken up because they almost got into an accident. He was shaken up because he saw a moose. He didn't know moose existed, and so seeing this enormous creature suddenly in the middle of the road right in front of them just had totally spooked him. And so after this, Isaac loved to bring this story up as a way of kind of making fun of Isaiah for his fear of moose, but it was totally in a loving way, and Isaiah would always laugh right along with him. But despite how well everything was going in both Isaiah and Isaac's lives to that point, everything would come crashing down in 2008. On May 13th, 2008, so 2 years after Isaiah showed up in Canada, Isaac got a phone call from his employer, the local newspaper, who told him he needed to head into town to take some pictures of a crash that had just happened. A helicopter had been flying over Cranbrook conducting a power line survey when they had lost power and crashed. And all 3 people, the pilot and the 2 people in back who were actually doing the survey, they all died on impact. Isaac, like everybody else who heard about this, was totally shocked. 1, because it was totally tragic and horrible, but 2, because nothing ever happened in Cranbrook. So to have something so big like this happen right downtown was just unheard of. And so Isaac hopped in his car and he began making his way towards the crash site. And it didn't take long before he saw this massive ring of people right at the intersection between 10th and 14th Street. They were all on the sidewalk and up on buildings, and everyone's just looking in towards this massive mound of jagged metal that was on fire, and all this black smoke was coming off of it. And there's ambulances nearby and police, and the fire department was there, and they're trying to put out the flames, but they can't do it. And so Isaac parks his car and he rushes over to this ring of people and he works his way towards the front. He pulls out his camera and he began taking pictures, first of the wreckage and the fire, and then also of the police as they put tarps over the bodies. Little did Isaac know, these pictures he was taking were about to take on a whole new significance for him. Earlier that day, just before 1 p.m., Isaiah wrapped up his final class of the day, and after he was done, he remembered he had some letters in his backpack that he had been meaning to mail to his family back in Kenya. And so he decided on his way home, he would make a detour to the post office and he would mail those letters. And so he left the building where this final class was and he stepped out into the bright sunshine of that May day. He put his headphones on and then he began to walk. At about 1:05 p.m., he arrived at the post office and he went inside just long enough to put his letters in the mail slot, and then he headed back outside. 1 minute later, at 1:06 p.m., as he was crossing 10th Street, the helicopter above lost power and crashed directly on top of Isaiah. Within seconds, he and the 3 people on board the helicopter would all be dead. It's believed because Isaiah was listening to music on his headphones, he didn't even hear the helicopter as it was crashing down. He was just walking, and then he was dead. It was a total freak accident. It wasn't until later that day that Isaac would realize the pictures he had taken of this scene included pictures of his friend. The next and final story of today's episode is called Wires Crossed. At around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of August 12, 1944, a young American military pilot named Joe walked out of his quarters on his base in England where he was stationed. And as soon as he was outside, he lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and as he smoked the cigarette, he began walking towards the huge hangar on the other side of the base where his plane was waiting for him. Joe had been preparing for this night for weeks. He and his co-pilot, a 35-year-old lieutenant who was nicknamed Bud, were about to step off on a top-secret military mission called Operation Aphrodite. And this mission was not only top secret, but it was so unbelievably dangerous that basically anybody who knew about it considered it a suicide mission. But Joe tried not to think about that as he walked towards the hangar. Instead, he tried to think about the reason he was here in the first place, the reason he had joined the military, and that was to defeat the Nazis. And what he and his co-pilot were about to do, Operation Aphrodite, was going to play a huge role in defeating the Nazis. So this was about 5 years into World War II, and at this point, the Nazis were actually losing. However, it was making them more dangerous, not less, because they were becoming very, very desperate. And so they were launching all these outrageous attacks, basically because they had nothing to lose. And one horrible thing the Nazis were doing at this time were dropping these things called vengeance weapons. Hitler called them vengeance weapons. They were basically these huge bombs that the Nazis would drop arbitrarily across the United Kingdom on major population centers. And by this point in the war, these vengeance weapons had killed over 5,000 civilians. And at this exact moment, like this night, as Joe was walking towards the hangar, the Nazis had a stash of vengeance weapons aimed directly at London. That was going to be their next target. And so the mission that Joe and his co-pilot Bud were going on, Operation Aphrodite, was going to be to go out and destroy those vengeance weapons to save London. And as nervous as Joe was about this mission, and he was really nervous, he was also very excited. He actually had volunteered for this mission when many other pilots had done everything they could to stay away from this mission. And on top of that, Joe actually had flown enough missions by this point in the war that he didn't need to fly any more. He could just go home. But instead, he volunteered for this mission. And a reason why Joe might have decided to do that has a lot to do with the family he was raised in. So Joe came from a family that was very successful and accomplished, and his father really pushed Joe and his younger brother to be the very best at whatever they were doing and to be very competitive with each other. And so while Joe and his younger brother did love each other, they also had a pretty intense rivalry. And for a while, Joe's father obviously favored Joe. I mean, Joe was the favorite child, and, his father would always say, Joe's going to be the president someday. He's so talented. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, both Joe and his younger brother joined the military, and pretty early on in the war, Joe's younger brother got an award for heroism. He had basically saved his platoon of men, and he won all these awards, and he was all over the news. And pretty quickly after that, Joe felt like he fell out of favor with his dad, that his dad kind of looked at the younger brother as being the favorite child now. And so Joe really started to feel insecure and wanted to prove himself really to his dad. And so when Operation Aphrodite came up, Joe volunteered for it really because he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to show his dad that he too could do something huge and change the course of history. And he would change the course of history, but not in the way he expected. And so Joe continued to smoke a cigarette and hustled across the base towards the hangar. And as he did, he found himself kind of speeding up, like he just wanted to get over there and get started. Joe's commanders had given him a special code he would call out over the radio if this mission was successful. It was spade flush. That's what he'd say over the radio. And so as Joe hustled towards the hangar, he imagined how incredible it was going to be to yell out spade flush over the radio. I mean, it was only like 30 minutes away from that moment. This was a short mission. And so finally, Joe reached the hangar and he looked up to the sky one more time to make sure the weather looked solid, because actually they had tried to launch Operation Aphrodite a couple of days earlier, but it had been canceled because of fog. But Joe looked around and the weather looked good. And so he knew it was going to be a go. So he flipped his cigarette butt and stepped into the hangar. Inside this hangar was this massive, big open space. And in the center of the hangar on the floor was this huge plane called a B-24 Liberator. This was, of course, Joe's plane for the night. And so Joe immediately began walking towards the plane to check it out. Now, this particular type of plane was the type of plane Joe had been flying for the past 3 years. I mean, he'd flown many combat missions in this type of aircraft, so he was very familiar with it. But this particular B-24 was unlike any of the other B-24s Joe had ever flown. In fact, this aircraft was so unique, it was unlike any aircraft that any pilot in the American military had ever flown. I mean, this was really a one of one. And so as Joe walked around the outside of this plane, he began to notice some of these unique modifications that the mechanics had made to this aircraft. The most noticeable modification was actually the cockpit. Now, normally the cockpit had all these windows basically all around it, so the pilot could look in any direction and see what was going on, but obviously they needed to be protected from the elements. But this B-24 had all the glass removed except for one pane of glass, basically right in front of where Joe would be staring, just like a single windshield. And so it's almost like it was a convertible aircraft where it was all open air in the cockpit. And the reason for this change is because Joe and his co-pilot, during the course of this top secret mission, Operation Aphrodite, they would have to jump out and parachute to the ground. And so by having this all open, it would allow them to do that much easier. And then another big modification to the B-24 is the guns that were normally located on the outside of the aircraft were gone, and they were replaced by broomsticks painted black to look like guns at a distance. But the visible changes to this particular B-24 were nothing compared to the massive changes that were hidden inside this aircraft. Because the top secret part of Operation Aphrodite was really this particular plane. The plane was not really a plane, it was more like a huge flying bomb. The military's mechanics basically hollowed out the entirety of this plane, removed everything inside of it that was not absolutely vital, and they replaced it with explosives. 10 tons of explosives. Like, this is an unbelievable amount of explosives. A few minutes later, at around 5:55 p.m., Joe and his co-pilot Bud, who by this point had come into the hangar, finished doing their exterior inspection of the aircraft, and then they climbed into the cockpit, with Joe taking a seat in the pilot's seat and Bud sitting in the co-pilot's seat. And even though the evening was cool, both men were visibly sweating. Once the pilots got the go-ahead to begin the mission, Joe fired the first engine and then turned to look at the ground crew all around them, and he noticed all of them looked really, really serious. I mean, they obviously knew how intensely dangerous this mission really was, and the fact was, the pilots might not make it home, and so they're looking up at these guys like, I'm sorry you have to do this. But Joe, he looked out at these people and he sensed that was going on, and so he made a big show to wave and smile at them, to show confidence, like he knew what he was going to do, he's going to be fine. But in reality, Joe really was terrified. By 5:59 p.m., Joe had all 4 propellers spinning on the aircraft, and so he released the brake and began taxiing out to the runway. And as they bumped along, Joe and Bud became really aware of just how heavy this aircraft was from all the explosives. I mean, every bump, this plane is lurching up and down and really creaking and making lots of noises. I mean, this was sketchy. Finally, Joe went full speed ahead, and he and Joe went tearing down the runway, and at some point, the plane did get lift, and it took off into the air. And then just up ahead of him were 6 other planes that had just taken off moments before, who were going to escort Joe and Bud to their target area. Once Joe got the plane to its cruising altitude, he and Bud kind of relaxed for a second and began preparing themselves for what was going to happen next. They had about 15 minutes of just kind of casual flying before the real work of this mission began. The vengeance weapons that Joe and Bud were going out to destroy as part of Operation Aphrodite were located about 120 miles south, just outside of this little town in the very northern tip of France. But destroying these weapons would not be as simple as just Joe and Bud flying over top and releasing all their explosives and flying back home. Because the Nazis had buried these vengeance weapons deep inside the hills in this town in northern France. And so regular bombs wouldn't touch these vengeance weapons. They had to do it a different way. And the way they were going to do it was Joe and Bud were going to fly their plane directly into the hills. And the way they would do this is they would fly their plane as close to the target area as possible, at which point one of the other pilots that were in the escort planes would take remote control of the B-24 flying bomb. And then once they had remote control, Joe and Bud, who no longer needed to do anything, they would jump out and parachute to the ground. And then the pilot who was remotely flying this now vacant B-24 flying bomb, they would just set it on autopilot to crash into the hills. At around 6:15 p.m., just as the English Channel came into view, Joe toggled a switch on his control panel, and then after he did, he and Bud kind of held their breath for a second to see what would happen. And then a couple of seconds later, the plane kind of shuddered for a second, and then leveled out, and then a call came over the radio from one of the pilots who were in the escort planes, telling Joe and Bud that they had just successfully taken remote control of the B-24. So at this point, Joe and Bud are no longer flying the aircraft, they're just sitting inside of this flying bomb. Now, there were only 2 things left for Joe and Bud to do before they could bail out to safety. They would need to arm the plane, so basically arm the explosives and make them ready to detonate. And then after that was done, they would need to call out over the radio, spade flush, the code Joe was given, which would signal to everybody else that the plane was ready and Joe and Bud were jumping out. And so once Joe and Bud nodded to each other and kind of acknowledged that, okay, we're going to do the last bit of this mission, Joe turned around in his seat and he looked at this control panel that was right behind him, and on this panel was the arming switch. And so once Joe flipped this, he and Bud would have a very short window of time to safely escape the aircraft. And so it was kind of like, flip it, make the radio call, and get the heck out of there. But Joe and Bud had trained for this moment over and over and over again, so they were ready. And so eventually, Joe flipped the switch, grabbed his radio, and called out, "Spade flush." What Joe and Bud could not have known when the mechanics were making all these modifications to this B-24 was that one of the mechanics accidentally crossed some wires in putting in all these explosives. And so just seconds after Joe had armed the explosives, they detonated. They were not supposed to, but they did. And so Joe and Bud were killed basically a fraction of a second after calling out "Spade flush." But it would turn out the catastrophic failure of Operation Aphrodite had no impact on World War II. In fact, Operation Aphrodite should never have happened in the first place. It was totally unnecessary. What Joe and Bud and the rest of the American military didn't know at the time was 5 weeks earlier, the British Royal Air Force dropped a whole bunch of ground-penetrating bombs all across those hills in northern France, and they destroyed all of the vengeance weapons. So when Joe and Bud took off on this doomed mission, there was no threat to London. None. But that is not the big reveal in this story, because Operation Aphrodite changed the course of American history in a really specific and really enormous way. Because Joe, whose full name was Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., was a member of the very famous Kennedy family, a big-time political family in America. And at the time, the Kennedys were all saying Joseph is going to be the next president of the United States. And everybody believed it. He was going to be the guy. But then, of course, Operation Aphrodite changed all of that because Joseph was killed. And so the war would end about a year later, and when it did, Joseph's younger brother, John F. Kennedy, who won that award for heroism and got a Purple Heart early on in the war, and he kind of became a war hero, which prompted Joe to volunteer for Operation Aphrodite. Yeah, John would begin his unbelievable political rise. And by 1960, John F. Kennedy, JFK, would become the 35th president of the United States, even though he wasn't supposed to. He was the second choice. It should have been Joe. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 4 stories that are all about ordinary people who at some point make a critical, single decision that not only changes their lives, but also impacts the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the world. The audio from all 4 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Debt Game, and it's about a man in South Korea who becomes inspired by his favorite manga. The second story you'll hear is called Hospital Rhythms, and it's about a young boy in a hospital who finds solace in music. The third story you'll hear is called Storming the Castle, and it's about a young singer who takes a huge leap of faith. And the fourth and final story you'll hear is called Imposter Syndrome, and it's about an actor who hits rock bottom, but then the unthinkable happens. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, on the next really hot summer day, offer to make the follow button a nice fresh cup of lemonade. But don't tell them you used salt instead of sugar. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Debt Game. One afternoon in 2009, a 38-year-old man was sitting inside of a manga cafe in Seoul, South Korea. So a manga cafe is a lot like a normal cafe. You can go inside and buy snacks or drinks and socialize, do whatever. But also, in manga cafes like this one, they have these big in-store libraries that contain manga. And manga are like comic books. Now, this man did not have a lot of money. And so when he went inside of this cafe, he didn't buy any drinks or food. He just went up to the in-store library, grabbed an edition of his favorite manga series, and just sat down and began to read. Now, this man had read this particular series multiple times. He just kept coming back to it because he thought it was like the best manga you could possibly read. Now, a lot of people actually didn't know what to make of this particular series. It was actually kind of controversial because it was so over-the-top violent, like well beyond any other series. But to this man, that sort of made it stand out. It made it sort of special, and he loved it. In fact, it was so crazy, this series, that every time he read it, it allowed him to sort of leave his life for a second and just totally escape into this wild, violent story. And right now, in this man's life, he really needed that escape, because his real life was pretty terrible. He had spent practically his whole life studying and working to try to become a professional writer and director. But in Seoul, the entertainment industry was pretty unpredictable. And so this man had successfully landed a couple of jobs here and there, doing some writing and, doing some directing, but they were small gigs and they typically fizzled out at some point. And so over and over again, like right now in this man's life, he found himself back in the same position he always was in, which was unemployed. At the moment, this man lived with his mother and his grandmother. But even though all three of them were pooling their resources, they still struggled to just pay for rent. In fact, recently, the man had to sell his laptop, the thing he used for all of his writing. It was like how he was going to eventually crack a career in entertainment for real. He had to sell that just so that they wouldn't get evicted. And if that wasn't bad enough, the man had also begun taking out all these short-term loans with high interest rates just to pay for basic needs. Forget rent, like just food and basic necessities he was taking out loans for, but he had no way to pay them back. And so the debt was just piling up nonstop. And so for this man, the stress was like unbearable. And the only way he could find to even begin to cope with it was to escape into his manga books. And even though he knew that didn't solve his problems, he didn't care. It was like, life is so bad, at least briefly, I can read manga and escape. And so that's what he was doing today. And so he took his favorite manga booth, he sat back inside of the booth, and just allowed himself to get sucked into the story for the 20th time. He's read this thing multiple times. And so as he was reading this manga book, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, this man all the time came up with various story ideas that maybe he could write and would be the next big thing for him. But for some reason, it was like, wait a minute, what if I write a story that's sort of, loosely based or at least inspired by my favorite piece of writing, this manga series? Like, wait a minute, I think I have a really good idea that sort of transcends any other idea I've ever had. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized there were other elements of his life that he could sort of attach to this story that's sort of beginning with this concept that came from this manga series. And so before long, he had put the manga book aside, got a pen and some paper, and just began writing down some ideas, general ideas for this new story he was going to try to write. And for hours and hours, he sat in the booth just writing like crazy. And by the time the cafe was closing, he had this amazing outline of a whole world, this whole story he was going to write. And he just knew this was the one. This was the thing that was going to break him out of poverty and officially make him a successful writer. Several months later, this man had transformed that amazing outline into a fully realized project, and then he went out to try to sell it. And he's thinking, everybody's going to want this thing. This is like an iconic, unique piece of IP. People are going to be clamoring to buy this. But what he found very quickly is every buyer he went to hated it. They told him, this is simply too weird and way too violent. Like, this is well beyond what's reasonable. This is not something anybody's going to want. Like, you will not have an audience for this. And the man was sort of crushed because to him, it was so clear. This is an amazing idea. This story is so good. People that have experienced real poverty, who understand the lengths that people will go to make money when they are desperate, they'll relate to this. Like, there's a huge audience for this. But the buyers, they didn't see it that way. And so for the next 10 years, this guy kept trying to sell this story. I mean, he really genuinely believed in it. And he figured someone's going to take a chance on this. They have to. It's too good. But for 10 years, everybody just kept saying, no, it's not good enough. No one wants this. But then, sort of out of left field, 10 years later, a major production studio actually said, you know what? This looks pretty good. We will buy it. This man's story was converted into a TV show, and it premiered in 2021, 12 years after the man originally conceptualized of the story inside of that manga cafe. And when this TV show aired, it was basically a global phenomenon overnight. It became the most talked about show anywhere in every corner of the internet pretty much immediately. It also made the production company that bought this story $900 million. And the man who actually wrote the story, he also got paid very well, and he won an Emmy. The manga series that this man read that sort of inspired all of this to happen was called Battle Royale. And in this series, these students are forced to fight to the death by a fascist government. And so what this man did is he combined that concept, fighting to the death, with something that he himself was dealing with in his own life, which was poverty. And he knew firsthand, the lengths he was willing to go just to make a little bit of money to make ends meet. And he knew other people who, were dealing with poverty were also sort of desperate, and they would go to great lengths just to make ends meet. And he said, okay, let's marry those two concepts. Poor people who were fighting to the death for money. The writer's name was Hwang Dong-hyuk, and the name of this TV series was Squid Game. Our next story is called Hospital Rhythms. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. He coughed and wheezed as he slowly walked down the hall next to other sick kids as they made their way towards the hospital's classroom. Now, Rich didn't know what kind of lesson he and the other kids were going to get today, but frankly, he didn't care. Anything was better than just sitting in his hospital room, bored out of his mind. So Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And over the past 10 weeks, he'd been bouncing around to different hospitals, and in fact, his condition was still so bad that this hospital had informed his parents that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And as awful as this sounded to Rich, this actually was not the first time something like this had happened to him. When he was 6 years old, his appendix burst, and then he contracted an infection that left him in a coma for several weeks. And then when he came out of the coma, he had to recover in a hospital for nearly a year. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. And because his family was not a well-off family, they couldn't afford to hire a tutor to kind of keep Rich up to speed. And so basically at this point, Rich's education consisted of, whatever random classes these hospitals he was staying in sporadically had. Whenever they hired a teacher to come in and teach basket weaving or, shop class, whatever was available, that was his education. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he did not have high expectations about what he would be taught that day. He figured it was just going to be some random class that he would sit through that at least was keeping him out of his hospital bedroom. But the instant he saw the teacher for the day and saw what was surrounding the teacher, he was really excited. Because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. He had seen one day in a Windows shop a drum set and he had wanted it so badly, but his family didn't have the money to pay for it, so he had never had a chance to do it. But now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so when the teacher began handing out the instruments to the kids, Rich demanded that he get the drum set. He would not play anything else. And the teacher was like, okay. And so he was given the drum. And then that day, the teacher led the class, through a couple of basic songs, and Rich played the drum, and he and everybody else were objectively terrible, like the music was awful. But by the end of the class, Rich was totally revitalized here. I mean, he hadn't discovered some special new talent for playing the drums, but he had discovered that he had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So, the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. And then also every few weeks, when the music teacher came back to the hospital, Rich would go to those classes and he would try to learn as much as he possibly could from the teacher. And that was basically his whole life, was those classes and banging on everything he could. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, despite having his health back, it isn't like his life suddenly got a whole lot easier. It isn't like, he left the hospital and magically became this amazing drummer and that was his life. Instead, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. And for Rich, he felt like that was the right thing to do. He didn't resent his family. This is what his life was. And what he did is he found joy, while he was working in grabbing makeshift drumsticks and just banging on stuff any chance he could. And he figured that that would be his life. He would just work and, find joy in drumming whenever he could. But Rich's outlook on life changed dramatically on Christmas of 1956, so a year after he had left the hospital. Because on that Christmas, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. To this point, Rich had not been able to have his own drum set. Everything was makeshift. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit, and Rich is like, this is the best gift I've ever been given. And he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off. And before long, he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right as Rich is kind of hitting his stride being this kind of local celebrity, this local very popular band fired their drummer. And so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, hey, will you join our band? And Rich said, let's do it. By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles. Our next story is called Storming the Castle. One afternoon in the early 2000s, a young woman named Rose drove up to this huge mansion in the Hollywood Hills in California. She came to a stop outside the fence, and she just sat there for a minute feeling very nervous because what she was about to do was highly illegal. So Rose was a musician, but she definitely had not made it yet. However, she was desperately trying to break into the industry. And so her big plan today was she was going to sneak in to this mansion, which was home to arguably one of the most famous people on the planet, a big-time musician. And her plan was to give them a copy of her demo CD, because she believed if they would just listen to just one song on there, they would be blown away by her talent and they would help usher her into the industry and her career would take off. Now, obviously, she knew this could go horribly wrong, and, the owner of this home could just as easily call the police and have her thrown in jail, but to her, it felt like the risk was worth it. And so Rose got out of her car and she looked up this huge driveway that extended up this hill, and it reached this big gate that sort of blocked off the driveway about halfway up. And then the driveway beyond the gate continued up to the mansion. And from where she was standing, there really was nobody out on the property anywhere. It was totally quiet, just this massive mansion up on a hill. But in front of the gate, on her side of the gate, was clearly the gardener. And, at first she thought maybe, the gardener was going to be a problem, that of course they would see her if she tried to break into the property. But, Rose was desperate and she thought the gardener looked friendly enough. And so she decided she would go up and maybe try to convince the gardener to let her go through the gate. And so she took a deep breath, and with her demo CD in hand, Rose began walking up this first stretch of driveway. And as she got closer to the gate, the gardener stopped what they were doing and turned to kind of see what this person was doing. And, Rose was very young and charismatic, and she seemed friendly enough. And she comes walking up the driveway, and she approaches the gardener and pulls out a $5 bill and hands it to the gardener and just says, look, I got no money. This is my last $5. Please, will you let me go through? I just want to drop something off. And so the gardener takes the $5 and just smiles at Rose and says, okay, go ahead. After all, Rose is like a kid. She seems completely harmless. What's the worst that could happen? And so Rose is kind of blown away that the gardener is actually letting this happen, but she doesn't wait. She just goes right past the gardener, slips through the front gate, and starts walking right up towards the mansion. And as Rose is walking up this driveway towards the front door of this gargantuan piece of property, she's looking around at the beautiful landscaping and just how valuable and beautiful everything looked. And she's seeing all these cameras pointing in every direction. And she's just waiting for any minute, security guards to come running out here and tackle her to the ground. But nothing happened. She walked right up to this huge, beautiful front door. And again, no one's come to meet her. And so she just knocks on the front door, but nobody comes to the door. So she's thinking, what do I do? I've come this far. I really want to hand this demo CD off. And so almost like without even thinking, she just reached down and tried the doorknob, thinking, of course it's going to be locked. But no, it was open. And so she turns the doorknob and pushes the door in. And now she's looking into the home of, again, one of the most famous people on the planet, and nobody's stopping her. At this point, Rose didn't even know what to make of the situation she found herself in. I mean, she had been fantasizing about how this was going to go for weeks leading up to this, and it didn't involve it being this easy and straightforward. But here she was, and so again, without hesitation, she just walked inside this home. And as she's looking around, I mean, everything is beautiful and everything is clearly so expensive. There's all this amazing artwork and fancy furniture. There's billiard halls, there's wine cellars. I mean, this is a gorgeous property, exactly what you'd expect for the person who lives here. And as she's kind of snooping around the first floor, looking for the owner, she's amazed to see that it's like nobody's home. It's just this vacant, unbelievable mansion. Eventually, she walks around and finds there's an elevator, and so she's like, all right, I'll just get in the elevator and go up. So she gets in this beautiful elevator, she shuts the door, she hits the button to go to the next floor, and as the car begins to move, she realizes like this is gonna make some noise, like someone's gonna hear me, like oh my gosh, now I'm gonna get caught. And so she starts to freak out, and so she pulls out her big clunky Nokia cell phone, and she calls her mom, and when her mom picks up, she tells her that, you know what, almost certainly I'm about to get arrested here. And as her mom is like, what are you doing? What is going on here? The elevator that Rose is in came to a stop, and the door opened up. And as soon as Rose saw what was in front of her, she just lowered the phone, her mom still talking into it, and just stared. It was like she was totally struck by what she was seeing. Because right in front of her, in the room right outside of this elevator, is the person who owns this house. The extremely famous major celebrity who's just sitting there with a guitar, strumming along, just minding his own business. And he turns and looks at Rose, and Rose is looking at him, and there's this moment of just stunned silence. Like neither of them can really figure out how this even came to be. Now at this point, Rose knew it was her chance. And so even though she's unbelievably starstruck and scared and has no idea what's about to happen, she just quickly walks a little bit forward into the room and throws her demo CD onto this table that was sort of between the two of them. And this big time musician is just like, again, standing there staring at her like, what are you doing here? And after Rose did that, she didn't say anything. She just turned, headed back to the elevator, and began to make her escape. But by the time she made it back to the front door, this big-time musician's security team did catch up to her and they stopped her. However, they did decide not to call the police. And so Rose was very lucky that she escaped without a criminal record, which is sort of incredible when you consider the home she actually broke into. This was the home of Prince. Again, arguably at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. I mean, it's bad enough sneaking into anybody's home, but this is like egregious. So the idea that she got right up next to Prince and gave him her demo CD without consequence, pretty incredible. But despite all this, her interaction with Prince really didn't have any bearing on her career. He didn't care at all about her demo CD. He did not, throw her name out to industry contacts and, blow her career up. Basically, he said, I won't press charges, now get out of here. That was it. However, Rose did go on to become an incredibly famous musician in her own right. She just did it without the help of Prince. Today, Rose's tracks go multi-platinum, and she's sold more than 100 million copies of her records. Rose is actually her middle name. You very likely know her by her stage name, which is also her actual first name, and that is Kesha. The next and final story of today's episode is called Imposter Syndrome. One day in 2008, a 50-year-old man named Carlo was at his home in Connecticut reviewing all this financial documentation. So Carlo had filed for bankruptcy a few years earlier, and it had proven to be very complicated. And there was all this paperwork he was still getting, and his bankruptcy case had not even finalized yet. And so what he thought would be sort of like a quick fix to a huge problem had turned into a really complicated mess. And now he had even more paperwork to sign. I mean, it was totally overwhelming. So Carlo was an actor, and in many ways he had had lots of success. He had been on Broadway, he had starred in shows and movies, like he was a respected actor with lots of contacts in the industry. But despite that, he hadn't really ever made it. Like he couldn't really consistently land high-paying or even consistent work, period. And so despite his reputation as being a very talented actor, it really wasn't translating to financial success. Now, this situation that Carlo was in would not have been that bad if he was single, but he wasn't. He was married with 4 children to take care of. And on top of that, Carlo also felt this really intense pressure that was sort of maybe felt in the industry in general, in the sort of entertainment industry, to keep up with his appearances. As much as he was struggling financially, he felt like he didn't want his peers to know that might eat into his ability to get big roles. And so he's got all this pressure to take care of his family and all this pressure to maintain this idea that he's really successful and doing great. But in reality, he just felt like a total fraud. He had no money, and he felt like he didn't even know how he was going to dig himself out again. And so as Carlo is sitting there staring at this mountain of paperwork, he started to have this very dark thought that had sort of crept into his mind a couple of times over the past few months, as this huge issue just continued to get bigger and bigger. But now, this dark idea had become fully realized in his mind. He began to think, maybe if I were to die, there could be a large insurance payout to my family. That would solve their financial problems, and it would also sort of, abscond me from looking like the fraud that I really am. Nobody would know. I'd be dead. They wouldn't know that I had all these issues. I'd just, be gone, and people would miss me and my family. They'd be financially taken care of. Maybe that's a possibility. Obviously Carlo was not trying to end his life because he didn't want to be here anymore. He just felt like he did not have another way out. And so he actually went to his wife and began sort of, nonchalantly asking her questions about their, various insurance plans to see if he had a good life insurance policy that would pay out if he were to go. And eventually he got his wife to tell him that, yeah, you have a very generous life insurance policy. We are good if, the worst were to happen and something were to happen to you. And at that point, Carlo felt like, that's it. That's the way to fix this problem. I need to die. However, when Carlo actually did begin researching this route, seeing exactly how, an insurance payout would work if he were to take his own life, he quickly learned that, payouts after a suicide on these life insurance plans are very complicated. And there's all these stipulations involved because, insurance companies do not want people taking their own life in order to get these payouts. And so Carlo was quickly seeing that if he were to take his life, it would not be like, okay, quick payout to his family. Quite the opposite. And in some cases, his family might not even be entitled to this payout. And so Carlo's thinking, well, okay, I can't take my own life. I need to find another way to have my life come to an end. And so he's thinking, okay, I'll start picking up really dangerous hobbies, and maybe I can sort of die by accident. Maybe I'll start hang gliding and fall out of my harness, and that'll be the way I die. And maybe that'll lead to a payout. Or I'll start doing base jumping, or all these different things that might reasonably explain why he suddenly died. But he also was thinking, people would see through that. I'm not the type of guy that picks up really dangerous hobbies, and so that could be kind of suspicious. He's like, okay, well, what else could I do? And he's like, oh, I could hire a hitman. Somebody else will kill me, and then, it's not my fault. Somebody else took my life. That'll allow for a payout, right? But, the more he thought about it, the more that too seemed highly suspicious. I mean, people don't usually get away with hired hits. And so several months go by, and Carlo is still alive, because he's basically discovered that there really isn't a way to intentionally end his life, directly or indirectly, without getting caught and sort of jeopardizing the one thing he wants this to do, which is to have this payout for his family. And so he's just sort of stuck in this situation that he does not feel like he can get out of. Like, he's just completely buried by debt and this general financial crisis he's in. And so Carlo was doing really the only thing he knew he could do, which is just to get out there and audition for as many shows and movies and various acting opportunities as he possibly could to at least, get some amount of money coming in, even though clearly it was still never going to be enough. But in late 2008, Carlo got an interesting call from his agent who worked to get him some of these roles. Now, Carlo's agent, who did understand Carlo was in dire straits here, quickly explained to Carlo that, this role didn't really pay much, but, you'd be able to be a part of a very big show. I mean, yeah, your role is sort of minimal, but this is huge. It's a big credit, and, maybe it lends itself to you getting other work. This could be a great opportunity for you. Now, Carlo had heard his agent sort of pitch him on various roles and the opportunity and all that before, and so he was grateful to be, told this is a good opportunity, but he was sort of skeptical. But he received the script and he began reading about, what his character would be doing in the show. And he quickly realized that, this role actually might be more perfect for me than even the producers and directors might realize. So this role was for this particular character on the show who sort of, in the show, hides in plain sight. Like, that's sort of the way they need to be portrayed. They're this huge influential character in one way, but to the eye of the audience, they sort of look like a nobody. They're sort of, again, hiding in plain sight. And Carlo, in his own life, very much felt like he was sort of hiding in plain sight. To his peers in the industry, he's this acclaimed actor who's getting all these roles and everything's so great. He's a family man with 4 kids. But privately, he's living this hell. He's got all this financial debt. He's considered killing himself for an insurance payout to pay for his life. Like, he's living a completely double life here. And so he felt like, I know how to hide in plain sight. It's literally what I do every day. That's my actual life. And so he takes this role, and Carlo does such a world-class job portraying this character who hides in plain sight that the director and all these people who are working on the show, they're like, oh my goodness, Carlo is incredible, and this character that he's portraying, we gotta find a way to expand this character and make them more meaningful in this show. And so they quickly began writing in additional scenes into this big time show for Carlo's character. Again, not because the character was so good, but because Carlo was so good at portraying that character. And as this character's role grew in the show itself began to succeed even more. Like, the audience was like, wow, we love that character. And so the character only grew and became a staple in this show, and it ultimately completely changed Carlo's life. Not only because this would be the opportunity that would make him massively famous and hugely successful, but also because he got paid and he was able to escape the financial hell that he was in. Through this incredible experience, Carlo would get paid millions and millions of dollars and would be nominated for multiple Emmy Awards. Now, you might know Carlo by his full name, which was Giancarlo Esposito. But if that name doesn't ring a bell, you very likely do know him from the life-changing role that he portrayed on this show. He was Gus Fring, the chicken shop kingpin from Breaking Bad. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.